Picture yourself scrolling through get-rich-quick schemes on social media while people in 1897 were literally walking thousands of miles through frozen mountain passes, carrying half a ton of supplies on their backs, gambling everything on rumors about gold deposits in a place so remote that isolated would be an understatement. Tonight, we're exploring the Klondike Gold Rush, humanity's perhaps most audacious example of mass delusion meeting extreme survival challenges. Before we dive in, quick methodological note. We're working with historical reconstruction here, interpreting first-hand accounts, photographs, and archaeological evidence through the lens of survival physiology and economic desperation. This isn't fiction, but individual experiences varied wildly between those who struck it rich, those who barely survived, and the many who didn't make it home at all. The uncomfortable truth that Gold Rush promoters didn't advertise. For every person who found fortune, hundreds discovered that opportunity in Alaska actually meant freeze while digging holes in permafrost for a year, find nothing, and return home broke. We're celebrating survivors while acknowledging the much larger group who became cautionary statistics buried in newspaper archives. This isn't romantic adventure story about brave prospectors. It's about desperate people making terrible decisions based on incomplete information, then using remarkable ingenuity to survive consequences of those decisions. It's about the difference between what promotional posters promised and what frozen reality delivered when thousands of unprepared city dwellers arrived in subarctic wilderness expecting easy wealth. So settle in comfortably. Maybe appreciate that your financial planning doesn't require surviving Alaskan winters in log cabins, and prepare to discover how gold fever created one of history's most impressive examples of mass voluntary suffering. Like this video if you're ready to explore extreme economic desperation meeting extreme environmental challenges, and tell us where you're staying comfortable tonight. Our journey begins in 1897, when newspapers announced Klondike gold discoveries, and tens of thousands of people decided that walking across frozen mountains carrying everything they'd need for a year sounded like reasonable investment strategy. Picture border control, where instead of checking your passport, Canadian mounted police literally weighed your supplies and refused entry unless you carried exactly 1,150 pounds of food and equipment, essentially running immigration checkpoint where admission requirements included demonstrate you won't starve to death and become our problem within 3 months. The RCMP's mandatory supply list wasn't arbitrary bureaucracy, but calculated survival minimum based on brutal experience with unprepared stampeders who'd arrived earlier and promptly discovered that Alaska doesn't have Walmart locations or food delivery services. The smell of thousands of supply piles being weighed and inventoried created logistics nightmare that made modern airport security look efficient by comparison. Archaeological evidence from abandoned supply caches shows exactly what 1,150 pounds meant in practical terms. Roughly 400 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of bacon, 100 pounds of beans, plus sugar, dried fruits, coffee, and enough other provisions to theoretically sustain one person for a year, assuming they didn't get tired of eating the same 7 foods in endless rotation. The logic of this requirement reveals that authorities understood most stampeders were spectacularly unprepared urban dwellers, whose wilderness experience peaked at "went camping once" in 1892, essentially requiring proof of minimum competence through supply possession before allowing entry into territories where incompetence had fatal consequences measured in months rather than years. The sound of arguments at checkpoints between stampeders and police created acoustic environments where desperation met bureaucracy. "But I don't need all this," versus "you'll need it when you're starving in February and the nearest store is 500 miles away through snow." The taste of defeat when turned back after traveling thousands of miles became common experience for those who'd underestimated supply requirements. Modern backpackers complaining about carrying 30-pound packs would find 1,150-pound supply requirements incomprehensible. Imagine needing to transport 6 months of groceries plus camping equipment through mountain passes where trail meant wherever previous person walked, and assistance meant maybe someone else struggling nearby has rope. Financial calculations show that mandatory supplies cost roughly $500 in 1897 dollars, approximately $17,000 in modern currency, meaning that before even starting the journey to goldfields, stampeders had to invest life savings amounts in provisions they'd then need to physically transport themselves because pack animals weren't available, and hiring porters would cost additional fortunes most people didn't possess. Picture climbing Stairmaster at gym, except the stairs are carved into ice at 35-degree angle. You're carrying 50-pound pack. It's below freezing, and there are thousands of other people creating human traffic jam, where stopping means blocking everyone behind you, and probably falling means sliding backwards into people who will be justifiably annoyed at being knocked down frozen mountainside. Photographic evidence of Chilkoot Pass shows lines of stampeders stretching up ice steps like deranged ants, creating what became known as the Golden Stairs. 1,500 steps carved into glacier ice that represented bottleneck, where entire gold rush could be delayed by weather, accidents, or simply volume of desperate people trying to simultaneously access same narrow passage. The smell of exertion, mixed with fear, created distinctive aroma at the base of the pass, where people prepared for climbs that would take 6-8 hours of continuous effort under optimal conditions, and significantly longer when weather turned hostile or when human traffic created delays that left climbers exposed on steep terrain where resting wasn't really an option. The logic of this ascent reveals why the relay system became necessary. Nobody could carry 1,150 pounds up 3,500-foot elevation gain in single trip, meaning stampeders made 30-40 round trips, carrying portions of supplies up, caching them at summit, and returning for next load, while watching their investment slowly accumulate at top of mountain through weeks of exhausting repetition. Evidence of avalanche victims shows that spring conditions made pass particularly dangerous when warming temperatures destabilized snow that could sweep away climbers with their supplies, creating situations where shortcut of attempting pass during marginally safe conditions meant risking becoming permanent resident of glacier rather than temporary visitor. The sound of ice axes striking frozen steps, mixed with heavy breathing and occasional screams when someone lost footing, created acoustic environments that would make modern extreme sports enthusiasts reconsider their definition of challenging terrain. The taste of blood from overexertion in cold air became familiar experience for people whose cardiovascular systems were discovering new performance limits. Modern hiking difficulty ratings would classify Chilkoot Pass as expert-level winter mountaineering. Yet thousands of office workers, shop clerks, and urban professionals with zero climbing experience attempted it because promotional materials had somehow failed to mention that trail to goldfields included basically climbing mountain while carrying weight equivalent to adult human on your back. Picture moving apartments. Except instead of hiring movers, you have to personally carry everything in 50-pound loads over 33 miles of mountain terrain, making 20 to 30 round trips, while your belongings remain scattered across checkpoints where theft, weather damage, and wild animals compete to destroy your investment before you can consolidate it at next staging point. Mathematical analysis of relay system reveals absurd logistics. Carrying 1,150 pounds in 50-pound loads required 23 trips up Chilkoot Pass, meaning each stampeder walked approximately 1,500 miles just to move their supplies 33 miles forward. Essentially, hiking distance from Seattle to Denver to transport goods from point A to point B, separated by afternoon's drive in modern vehicles. The smell of cached supplies, mixed with anxiety about theft, created constant stress, where leaving provisions unattended felt like abandoning life savings in unlocked car in bad neighborhood, except the car was pile of flour sacks, and the bad neighborhood was frozen wilderness, where desperation made honest people consider creative interpretations of property rights. Evidence of supply caches shows that stampeders developed marking systems, hiding strategies, and sometimes armed guard rotations to protect investments during relay process, essentially running medieval logistics, where you were simultaneously transportation company, security force, and inventory manager, trying to prevent losses that could mean starvation later. The logic of relay timing dictated that faster completion meant less exposure to theft and weather, creating competition where physical fitness directly translated to security, and where exhaustion had to be balanced against risks of leaving supplies unprotected for extended periods. The sound of people collapsing from overexertion, mixed with the crunch of boots on snow, became daily reality for those discovering that Gold Rush actually meant voluntary forced march carrying ridiculous loads. The taste of utter exhaustion became so familiar that modern athletes' understanding of tired would seem laughably inadequate. Imagine training for a marathon, except the marathon is 1,500 miles. You're carrying heavy pack, and there's no finish line celebration, just permission to start actual gold mining after months of this preparation. Photographic evidence shows supply dumps at various checkpoints, where stampeders' possessions created temporary cities of goods awaiting their owner's next relay trip. Picture warehouse district, except it's spread across Mountain Pass. There's no security beyond social pressure not to steal, and your inventory management system is, hope I remember where I left everything. Picture building boat using only hand tools, zero prior boat building experience, and whatever lumber you can scavenge, then betting your life and years' supplies on its ability to navigate rapids, whirlpools, and 500 miles of subarctic river system, where rescue services means maybe someone downstream will fish out your body eventually. Archaeological remains of boat-building camps show that stampeders constructed thousands of makeshift vessels at Lake Bennett, essentially running amateur shipyard where quality control ranged from surprisingly competent to floating coffin that will disintegrate at first serious obstacle. The smell of fresh-cut timber, mixed with pine pitch used for waterproofing, created construction zones where optimism about woodworking skills often exceeded actual carpentry capabilities. The logic of boat construction reveals desperate mathematics. Hiring professional boat builders cost money stampeders had already spent on supplies, while building yourself meant investing time and materials with no guarantee of seaworthiness until you actually launched into current that wouldn't forgive engineering mistakes. The sound of amateur hammering and sawing created acoustic environments indicating either successful adaptation or impending disasters. Evidence from Miles Canyon and Whitehorse Rapids shows why boat quality mattered. Historical accounts describe hundreds of vessels destroyed, supplies lost, and occupants discovering that knowing how to swim wasn't particularly useful skill when water temperature could cause hypothermia within minutes and nearest help was miles away through wilderness. The taste of fear mixed with river spray became familiar for those navigating sections where rocks, whirlpools, and powerful currents competed to demonstrate flaws in amateur boat design. Modern whitewater rafting guides would classify many Gold Rush boat routes as requiring expert-level skills and proper equipment. Yet thousands of complete novices attempted navigation, because alternative was walking remaining 500 miles through roadless wilderness, which seemed like worse option until boat started taking on water in middle of rapids. Photographic evidence shows everything from well-constructed scows to barely floating rafts held together by hope and questionable rope work. Picture maritime traffic where vessel safety inspections consisted of "does it float right now?" without considering whether it would continue floating under stress of actual river conditions. The psychology of boat launching involved ignoring obvious design flaws, because acknowledging them would require starting over, and time pressure from approaching winter meant that probably good enough became operating standard for decisions that could result in permanent swimming lessons in waters where survival time was measured in minutes. Picture racing against calendar, where losing means being trapped for 8 months in location without adequate shelter, supplies, or any possibility of evacuation, because rivers freeze solid and temperature drops to levels where going outside becomes activity requiring serious preparation and acceptance that frostbite is probable outcome of extended exposure. Seasonal timing data shows that Yukon River became unnavigable by mid-October, when ice formation made boat travel impossible, and freeze-up created conditions where being caught between destinations meant either emergency winter survival with inadequate supplies or desperate attempts at overland travel through conditions that made mountain passes look pleasant by comparison. The smell of approaching winter, mixed with collective anxiety, created pressure cooker environments where stampeders made increasingly risky decisions about whether to continue forward, turn back, or establish emergency winter camps with whatever supplies they currently possessed, essentially playing high-stakes gambling, where miscalculation meant months of suffering or permanent residence in permafrost. The logic of seasonal racing reveals brutal mathematics. Arriving at goldfields after freeze-up meant waiting until spring thaw to begin mining, wasting entire winter while consuming supplies that would need replacement before productive work could start. The sound of ice beginning to form in rivers created acoustic warnings that time for safe travel was expiring, and decisions needed immediate implementation regardless of readiness. The evidence from emergency winter camps shows that hundreds of stampeders got caught by early freeze-up, creating impromptu communities where people with inadequate shelter and insufficient supplies spent months in survival mode rather than productive mining. Imagine being forced to winter in a location you'd planned as brief rest stop, discovering that temporary inconvenience actually meant several months of making do with whatever you happened to have when movement became impossible. The taste of panic when realizing that calendar was winning race created decision-making environments where normally cautious people attempted dangerous river navigation in deteriorating conditions, because alternative of being stranded seemed worse than risks of attempting passage through increasingly hazardous waters. Modern weather forecasting and evacuation services make seasonal timing seem manageable, but Gold Rush stampeders relied on local knowledge, folk wisdom, and hope that this year's freeze-up would be late rather than early, essentially betting survival on weather patterns that varied unpredictably and didn't care about human scheduling preferences or inadequate preparations. Picture alternate route, where promoters promised easier passage suitable for pack animals, which turned out to mean trail so brutal that thousands of horses died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and injuries, creating literal pathway marked by animal corpses that gave route its cheerful nickname of Dead Horse Trail. Archaeological and photographic evidence shows approximately 3,000 horses perished on White Pass route during 1897-1898 rush, essentially running transportation system where business model was work animals to death because buying replacement is cheaper than properly maintaining them, creating conditions that made modern animal welfare advocates' concerns about working conditions seem quaint by comparison. The smell of decomposing horses mixed with mud created sensory nightmare where travelers couldn't avoid walking past or sometimes over animal remains because narrow trail offered no alternative routing around casualties. The sound of struggling pack animals mixed with their handlers' curses created acoustic environments that indicated either active cruelty or desperate attempts at moving supplies through terrain that exceeded animal capabilities. The logic of pack animal use reveals economic calculation, where horse life was worth less than wages for human porters, creating situations where animals were deliberately worked beyond recovery point, because their death represented acceptable business cost rather than tragedy requiring prevention. The taste of guilt mixed with pragmatic necessity became familiar for those who participated in system where animal suffering was normalized as operational requirement. Historical accounts describe trails so steep and muddy that horses fell regularly, breaking legs or becoming trapped in mud where they died slowly because extracting them required more effort than owners were willing to invest. Picture hiking trail where every few hundred yards there's dead pack animal serving as trail marker. And local attitude is basically, well, that's just how it is, rather than, maybe we should reconsider our transportation strategy. The modern hiking difficulty assessments would rate White Pass as challenging even without loads. Yet promoters marketed it as pack animal accessible, because technically animals could traverse it if you didn't care whether they survived the experience. Essentially running false advertising campaign where accessible meant physically possible rather than survivable with proper care. The psychological impact on stampeders included those who'd never seen large animals suffer and die in large numbers, discovering that Gold Rush economics made animal welfare incompatible with profit margins, creating moral compromises where people who considered themselves decent participated in systematic cruelty because alternatives seemed economically impossible. But surviving the journey to goldfields meant absolutely nothing if you couldn't figure out where to mine, how to build shelter before deadly winter arrived, and most importantly, how to extract gold from ground that was frozen harder than concrete year-round, using only hand tools and techniques you'd never practiced before in your life. Picture arriving at destination after months of brutal travel, expecting organized mining town with available claims and support infrastructure. Instead, discovering tent city of 5,000 desperate people, where available mining claims meant everything good was taken 2 years ago, and support infrastructure consisted of overpriced supplies and saloons that would happily take your remaining money. Historical records show Dawson City transformed from settlement of few hundred to chaotic boomtown of thousands within months, creating conditions where tent cities stretched for miles. Sanitation was non-existent, and new arrivals discovered that promotional materials had somehow failed to mention that all worthwhile claims were already staked by people who'd arrived during initial rush. The smell of thousands of unwashed people, inadequate sanitation, and wood smoke created a aromatic environment that would make modern music festival camping seem pristinely clean by comparison. Imagine arriving somewhere that smells like a combination of overworked horses, human waste, and desperate hope, realizing this is where you'll be living for next year minimum. The sound of claim registration office created acoustic chaos where hundreds of stampeders tried simultaneously to discover whether any decent mining ground remained unclaimed, with most learning that their options were buying existing claims from discouraged miners at inflated prices, or attempting to stake marginal ground that previous prospectors had rejected for good reasons. Archaeological evidence of early Dawson shows rapid construction using whatever materials were available, creating architecture that prioritized speed over quality,
and resulted in structures that were marginally better than tents, but still inadequate for temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit during winter months.
The taste of disappointment, mixed with sunk cost fallacy, became familiar for those realizing that after investing everything in reaching Klondike, turning back meant admitting complete failure, while continuing forward meant gambling remaining resources on increasingly uncertain prospects, essentially discovering that gold rush opportunity actually meant choose between multiple bad options with no guaranteed positive outcomes. Financial calculations show that claim prices in established areas exceeded what most stampeders could afford after spending savings on supplies and transportation, creating a market where speculation and hope drove prices beyond rational economic justification based on actual gold production from those claims. Picture shopping for mining claim, where your options are buy expensive, potentially worthless ground from someone who already tried and failed, or stake free claim in areas that professional miners deliberately avoided, probably for excellent reasons you'll discover through expensive personal experience. Claim transaction records show that established creek claims sold for $500 to $15,000 depending on location and rumored productivity, with most transactions based on hope rather than verified gold production, because sellers weren't obligated to disclose their actual findings or explain why they were suddenly eager to sell valuable claims. The smell of desperation mixed with salesmanship created marketplace environments where every failed miner became enthusiastic claim broker, explaining why their unproductive ground would definitely produce gold for new owner, despite having produced nothing for them. Essentially running used car lot, except the cars were holes in frozen ground, and the salesmen were people whose credibility was questionable at best. The logic of claim evaluation required geological knowledge most stampeders didn't possess, creating situations where assessment of potential was based on location relative to productive claims, appearance of dirt when randomly sampled, and gut feelings that had no basis in actual mining experience or geological understanding. Evidence from claim records shows that many stampeders purchased multiple claims, hoping that at least one would be productive, essentially running investment portfolio strategy, where diversification meant lose money on several claims instead of just one, for those whose luck and judgment both failed simultaneously. The sound of negotiations involved sellers enthusiastically describing gold they'd almost found, while buyers tried to determine whether stories represented genuine near misses or complete fabrications designed to extract money from gullible newcomers who couldn't distinguish between bad luck and worse judgment. The taste of buyer's remorse came quickly for those who discovered that their expensive claim consisted of frozen gravel that produced nothing but exhaustion and broken tools, creating realization that they'd essentially paid life savings for privilege of working brutal physical labor with no compensation beyond mounting debt and diminishing hope. Alternative of staking free claims meant hiking into backcountry, evaluating ground based on questionable criteria, and hoping that areas avoided by experienced miners represented overlooked opportunities rather than obvious dead ends that local prospectors had correctly identified as worthless. Picture house construction project, where deadline is before you freeze to death. Building materials are whatever trees you can cut down, and construction manual consists of watched someone build cabin once, seemed pretty straightforward, combined with desperate improvisation when reality contradicted remembered observations. Archaeological remains of miner cabins show structures averaging 10 by 12 feet, essentially building living space smaller than modern prison cell, which needed to serve as bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and storage for years' worth of supplies, while housing 1 or 2 people who would spend months unable to escape each other's company. The smell of fresh-cut logs mixed with moss used for chinking created construction environments where each day's progress was measured against approaching winter deadline that didn't care about construction delays, tool failures, or builder inexperience with log cabin techniques. The sound of axes striking frozen wood created acoustic backdrop indicating either successful building progress or mounting frustration when wood quality proved inadequate for intended purposes. The logic of cabin construction required balancing speed against quality, with most builders prioritizing finished before freeze-up over actually comfortable or particularly weatherproof, creating structures that would leak heat through every gap while providing minimally adequate protection from conditions that could cause frostbite in exposed individuals within minutes. The evidence from surviving cabins shows creative solutions and desperate compromises where builders used whatever materials were available, regardless of suitability. Sod roofs that would leak during spring thaw, gaps between logs that required continuous moss replacement, and door frames that didn't quite fit, creating permanent drafts that made heating nearly impossible. The taste of exhaustion from weeks of physical labor using unfamiliar tools in a race against calendar became familiar experience for those discovering that building cabin required significantly more skill, time, and physical capability than promotional materials had suggested when advertising opportunity to establish homestead in Alaska. Modern building codes would condemn most minor cabins as uninhabitable. Yet these structures had to serve as year-round housing, where internal temperatures could drop below freezing during coldest periods, despite continuous fire maintenance, creating living conditions that made modern camping seem luxurious by comparison. Picture dressing for outdoor work where temperature is -40 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll be performing heavy physical labor that causes sweating, and the sweat freezing against your skin can cause hypothermia faster than just being cold, essentially solving a thermal puzzle where being too warm is as dangerous as being too cold. Except the consequences of miscalculation include frostbite and permanent tissue damage. Historical clothing inventories show that successful miners developed layering systems using wool undergarments, multiple shirts, heavy outer coats, and fur accessories. But the challenge wasn't having enough clothing. It was managing perspiration that would soak inner layers during exertion, then freeze solid during rest periods, creating ice layers against skin that conducted heat away from body faster than metabolism could compensate. The smell of wool clothing that never fully dried, mixed with wood smoke and body odor, created aromatic signatures that modern hygiene standards would find intolerable. But changing clothes frequently wasn't an option when you owned maybe 3 sets of work clothes, and washing required melting snow, heating water, and having indoor drying space that competed with living area in tiny cabin. The logic of work clothing reveals brutal trade-offs. Heavy insulation prevented frostbite, but caused excessive sweating during labor, while lighter clothing allowed better temperature regulation, but risked exposure injuries during breaks or equipment failures. The sound of frozen clothing crackling when putting it on in morning became familiar experience for those whose garments had absorbed sweat overnight and transformed into semi-rigid ice sculptures. The evidence from frostbite treatment records shows that extremities were most vulnerable. Fingers, toes, nose, and ears suffered regular cold injuries that ranged from minor discomfort to permanent tissue loss requiring amputation. The taste of frozen face coverings that would stick to facial skin became routine annoyance that miners accepted as normal rather than dangerous warning about environmental conditions. Modern technical fabrics designed for moisture wicking would have seemed like miraculous technology to miners whose cotton and wool clothing retained moisture that became a liability in extreme cold, creating situations where your own sweat could become a weapon that cold temperatures used against you if you didn't manage clothing layers with constant vigilance. Glove management presented impossible choices: work barehanded and risk frostbite, or wear mittens and lose manual dexterity required for tool use. Picture trying to tie knots, handle small objects, or perform precision work while wearing boxing gloves. Then remember that removing gloves in -40 degrees Fahrenheit meant fingertips could freeze within minutes of exposure. Picture heating system where your furnace requires constant feeding. Fuel source needs harvesting from frozen forest using hand tools. And letting fire die overnight means waking up to interior temperatures that can freeze water in a bucket next to your bed. Essentially, running 24/7 maintenance operation, where negligence means discovering what really cold means when it's happening inside your supposed shelter. Fuel consumption estimates show that single miner cabin required approximately 1 cord of wood per week during deepest winter. That's 128 cubic feet of split firewood that needed cutting, hauling, and stacking continuously just to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. The smell of wood smoke became so pervasive that everything owned absorbed it permanently, with clothing, bedding, and even food taking on smoky flavors that modern people would find unpleasant but miners accepted as normal. The sound of axe work became daily soundtrack, where those who'd never chopped firewood in their lives discovered that frozen timber required significantly more effort than room temperature wood, with each swing producing a shower of ice crystals and minimal cutting progress until techniques were mastered through exhausting trial and error. The logic of fuel management reveals time theft problem. Hours spent cutting, hauling, and processing firewood were hours not spent mining, creating a situation where survival requirements competed directly with income-generating activities, and where falling behind on wood supply could cascade into crisis when weather prevented resupply during coldest periods. The evidence from cabin sites shows that successful miners located dwellings near timber sources to minimize hauling distances. But this meant rebuilding when local trees were exhausted, or accepting increasingly long wood-gathering expeditions that consumed even more time and energy from already exhausted workers. The taste of smoke-flavored meals became so routine that food without smoke notes would have seemed wrong. Imagine every meal tasting like it was cooked over campfire, because it literally was, and your kitchen ventilation consisted of hope smoke finds way out through gaps in cabin construction before everyone suffocates. Modern central heating users who complain about utility bills would find continuous manual fuel harvesting incomprehensible. Picture if maintaining comfortable home temperature required personally cutting down trees, splitting logs, and feeding furnace every hour, including nighttime when you'd really prefer to be sleeping. Picture starting your first day of actual mining, expecting normal digging experience, driving shovel into ground, and discovering that frozen permafrost has approximately same consistency as concrete, except with occasional rocks embedded for extra challenge. Essentially, learning through direct, unpleasant experience that mining frozen ground wasn't metaphorical description,
but literal, accurate assessment of problem you'd just committed to solving with hand tools. First-hand accounts describe shock when new miners discovered that pickaxes bounced off frozen ground without penetrating, shovels bent or broke when attempting to pry loose material, and entire days' exhausting effort might produce excavation depth measurable in inches rather than feet. The smell of exertion, mixed with growing realization that promotional materials had significantly understated difficulty, created environments where initial enthusiasm transformed into grim understanding that a year of back-breaking labor lay ahead, with no guarantee of finding gold sufficient to justify the investment. The sound of tools striking frozen ground created distinctive acoustic feedback, sharp metallic ringing indicating that ground was still too hard for effective digging, versus duller thuds suggesting some progress was occurring, with most beginners experiencing overwhelming majority of ringing sounds that indicated their technique, tools, or both were inadequate for conditions encountered. The logic of frozen ground mining reveals why fire and thaw method became standard practice. Permafrost at depth of gold-bearing gravel remained frozen year-round regardless of surface temperature, meaning that conventional digging was physically impossible without first thawing ground through controlled burning that raised local temperature enough to soften material.
The evidence of abandoned early attempts shows pits barely scratched into surface, where discouraged miners gave up after discovering that mining gold from frozen ground required techniques nobody had explained during rush preparations, creating early selection pressure that eliminated those unable to adapt methods to reality of permafrost conditions. The taste of defeat, mixed with sunk cost calculations, became familiar for those realizing that everything they'd invested in reaching Klondike would be wasted unless they figured out how to extract gold from ground that actively resisted all conventional mining approaches, essentially being told, "Surprise, your job is impossible with normal methods. Figure out something else or go home with nothing." But discovering that ground was frozen solid year-round was just the beginning of mining education, because figuring out how to actually extract gold required mastering techniques that were part engineering, part endurance test, and part acceptance that spending months digging holes in permafrost without knowing if there was any gold present was somehow rational use of limited remaining lifespan. Picture being told that proper mining technique involves building fire at bottom of hole you're digging, waiting overnight for heat to penetrate frozen ground approximately 10-15 centimeters, then removing thawed material before repeating process daily for months until reaching bedrock where gold theoretically accumulated. essentially running extremely slow construction project where daily progress could be measured with ruler, and annual progress created shaft deep enough to potentially find gold if you were lucky. Technical descriptions of fire thaw method show that miners burned small fires using wood that was also needed for cabin heating, creating resource competition where mining progress directly reduced comfort and survival margins. The smell of smoldering fires mixed with thawed earth created distinctive aromatic signature at active mines, indicating someone was making progress toward either fortune or elaborate, expensive hole with nothing at bottom. The logic of this technique reveals brutal efficiency problems. Each fire cycle required several hours of burning to thaw a small amount of material, meaning miners could complete perhaps one cycle per day if everything went perfectly, translating to maybe 10 feet of depth gain per month of continuous effort under optimal conditions that rarely occurred. The sound of fire crackling at shaft bottom mixed with miners' breathing as they worked in confined spaces that were simultaneously too hot near fire and too cold everywhere else created acoustic environments indicating either productive work or dangerous accumulation of smoke and combustion gases in poorly ventilated excavations. Archaeological evidence of mining shafts shows burn marks on walls indicating where fires were built, along with occasional evidence of collapses, suggesting that fire-weakened permafrost sometimes failed catastrophically when structural integrity was compromised by heating cycles that miners couldn't avoid if they wanted to make any progress. The taste of smoke-filled air became a constant companion for those working in shafts where ventilation was minimal, and breathing clear air required surfacing periodically, creating workflow interruptions that further slowed progress in activity that was already proceeding at glacial pace, though actually glacier movement might have been faster than typical mining advance rates. Modern excavation equipment that can dig through frozen ground would have seemed like supernatural technology to miners, whose fastest possible progress involved waiting for fire to slowly penetrate rock 1 hand's width at a time, creating timescale disconnect where daily effort produced almost imperceptible change, and monthly progress still left you far from bedrock, where gold supposedly waited. Picture amateur excavation project where you're digging 10, 20 feet underground in frozen soil that could collapse without warning, using only hand tools and hoping that your self-taught engineering knowledge prevents burial under tons of frozen gravel that won't thaw enough to dig you out until spring. Essentially, running construction site
where OSHA would file so many violations they'd need separate filing cabinet just for your operation. Shaft construction techniques varied from basically competent to actively suicidal, with depth requirements determined by geological conditions that placed gold-bearing gravel at varying depths below surface. The smell of damp earth mixed with wooden support timbers created sensory indication of depth where surface conditions no longer applied, and underground environment created its own microclimate.
The sound of ground settling provided acoustic early warning system for impending collapses, though interpreting these signals required experience that beginners didn't possess until after they'd survived several close calls that taught valuable lessons about distinguishing between normal sounds and pre-failure warnings. Evidence from accident records shows that shaft collapses represented constant danger, with partial collapses trapping miners temporarily, and complete failures sometimes resulting in permanent entombment that required difficult recovery operations. Essentially, working in an environment where workplace accidents could transition from injured to deceased without intermediate stages of emergency response because there wasn't emergency response available. The logic of excavation revealed that deeper shafts required more extensive timbering for wall support, creating material and labor requirements that competed with actual mining progress. Imagine a project where safety measures consume so much time and resources that they threaten project viability. But skipping them means accepting unacceptable risk of catastrophic failure. Material removal from depth created additional challenges, where buckets of excavated gravel had to be hauled vertically using rope and windlass systems that required either solo operation with inefficient up-down cycles or partnership, where one person spent entire day operating hoist while other worked underground, essentially splitting already limited workforce between actual mining and logistics support. The taste of underground air, stale, damp, and vaguely mineral, became familiar for those spending 8 to 10 hours daily in confined excavations, where fresh air was whatever drifted down shaft opening and circulated poorly through cramped working space that modern confined space regulations would prohibit entering without extensive safety equipment and monitoring. Picture work schedule, where you spend 8-10 hours daily performing brutal physical labor in conditions ranging from uncomfortably cold to actively trying to cause frostbite, with monotony broken only by equipment failures, weather crises, or growing realization that months of effort might produce nothing but debt and regret. Essentially, running personal hell simulation, where voluntary participation somehow seemed like reasonable career choice. Daily routine records show miners rising before dawn, working until dark, then spending remaining hours on survival maintenance activities like cooking, wood processing, and equipment repair, creating schedule where leisure time meant hours not actively working that were instead spent on tasks enabling continued work tomorrow. The smell of sweat-soaked clothing that never fully dried, mixed with wood smoke and kerosene lamp fumes, created cabin atmospheres that would make modern environmental quality inspectors recommend immediate evacuation. Yet these conditions represented normal baseline existence for people who'd lost perspective on what comfortable living meant after months of this routine. The sound of pickaxes striking frozen ground became metronome, marking passing time in occupation, where daily progress was measured in buckets of gravel rather than accomplishments requiring skill, creating psychological conditions where work felt simultaneously exhausting and meaningless, because results didn't justify effort invested. The logic of winter mining reveals perverse incentive structure. Only during coldest months could shafts be excavated safely, because warmer temperatures caused permafrost to destabilize and collapse, meaning that optimal working conditions were simultaneously most miserable living conditions. Imagine job that's only performable when weather makes simply being outside potentially fatal if exposure extends too long. Evidence of accumulated spoil piles shows that winter's work produced mountains of excavated material that would await spring thaw for processing, creating situation where miners spent months digging without knowing whether their efforts would be rewarded or wasted, essentially investing hundreds of hours based entirely on geological speculation and hope that someone else's success story would somehow apply to their claim. The taste of monotony mixed with fading optimism became familiar as weeks turned to months without any confirmation that gold existed in quantity sufficient to justify continued effort, creating psychological wear that was as damaging as physical exhaustion and environmental stress combined. Picture spending months digging shaft through frozen ground based entirely on hope that somewhere below you there's layer of gravel containing enough gold to justify this effort, with only way to verify being dig until you hit bedrock and check, creating situation where you won't know if you wasted months of brutal labor until after you've already invested those months and can't get them back. Techniques for evaluating gold content involved taking random samples from excavated material, panning small amounts to check for color, visible gold particles, and trying to extrapolate from these tiny samples whether entire layer justified continued effort, essentially running geological survey using methods that were barely more sophisticated than, does this dirt look promising? The smell of hope, mixed with damp gravel, became familiar during testing sessions where miners examined pan contents looking for yellow sparkle that could mean fortune, or fool's gold that meant continued uncertainty. The sound of gravel being swished in pan created acoustic backdrop for moments where optimism confronted reality through process that could reveal either vindication or disappointment. The logic of pay dirt evaluation reveals psychological torture element. Finding traces of gold meant you were probably on right track, but couldn't know whether quantity justified effort until processing much larger volumes. While finding nothing meant either you hadn't reached productive layer yet, or entire shaft was wasted investment. Essentially, getting results that were ambiguous enough to keep you working, but not definitive enough to provide certainty. The evidence from successful and failed claims shows that gold distribution in gravel was wildly inconsistent, with rich pockets existing near completely barren areas, creating lottery-like conditions where neighbors' success didn't guarantee your similar results, and failure didn't necessarily mean you should quit, because next shovelful might contain concentration that justified everything. The taste of disappointment became routine for those whose test pans showed minimal color despite months of work, creating situation where each negative result required decision about whether to continue gambling time and energy or accept losses and either try different location or abandon mining entirely. Modern geological surveying that can analyze soil composition and predict resource distribution would have seemed like witchcraft to miners whose prospecting techniques were barely more sophisticated than random guessing, supported by hopeful interpretation of ambiguous evidence. Picture waiting months for spring thaw, so you can finally process piles of gravel you excavated during winter, building crude water-based separation equipment using hand tools and whatever lumber you can scavenge, then discovering whether months of frozen misery produced anything valuable or just created expensive collection of worthless rocks, essentially running delayed gratification experiment where results arrive so late that you've had plenty of time to imagine both spectacular success and complete failure. Sluice box construction required understanding of water flow dynamics, gold settling behavior, and carpentry skills that most miners didn't possess, creating equipment that ranged from surprisingly functional to elaborate way to wash gold downstream while retaining worthless gravel. The smell of running water mixed with exposed earth created sensory indication that mining season had transitioned from excavation to processing phase. The sound of water flowing through sluice boxes mixed with gravel being shoveled created acoustic environments indicating active gold recovery operations, though volume of sound bore no relationship to amount of gold being captured, since successful and unsuccessful operations sounded essentially identical until cleanup revealed results. The logic of spring washing reveals timing pressure. Water flow depended on seasonal runoff that would diminish as summer progressed, creating window of opportunity where processing needed to occur before water sources dried up and forced suspension of operations until following spring, essentially having limited time to process winter's accumulation before weather conditions made continued work impossible. Evidence of sluice box designs shows considerable variation in construction and effectiveness, with some miners developing efficient recovery systems, while others used configurations that lost significant gold through inadequate flow control or improper riffle design. Imagine running chemistry experiment where your apparatus design directly determines whether you capture valuable product or accidentally wash it down drain.
The taste of anticipation mixed with dread became familiar during processing, when months of speculation would finally be resolved through direct observation of whether accumulated gravel contained gold in paying quantities, or whether entire winter's effort had produced nothing but elaborate collection of worthless material. Modern mineral processing that can efficiently separate even fine gold from large volumes of material would have revolutionized Klondike operations, but miners relied on gravity separation using hand-built equipment whose efficiency varied wildly and whose operation required constant attention to prevent losses through operator error or equipment failure. Picture cleanup day when you finally dismantle sluice box and examine accumulated material in riffles where gold should have settled. Experiencing moment where months of speculation, hope, and desperate labor culminate in direct observation of whether you found fortune, modest success, or absolutely nothing, essentially opening envelope containing test results that determine whether your gap year in frozen hell was brilliant investment or catastrophic mistake. Historical gold recovery records show that claims varied from spectacular producers yielding thousands of dollars per season to complete failures producing barely enough to cover basic expenses, with most falling somewhere between modest profit and didn't quite break even. Imagine job where annual performance review reveals whether you're wealthy, comfortable, or bankrupt, with no intermediate feedback during working period. The smell of gold amalgam mixed with mercury, used for capturing fine gold, created toxic processing environments that would violate modern safety regulations, but which miners accepted as normal because they didn't understand long-term health consequences of heavy metal exposure, essentially poisoning themselves while processing material that might not even contain enough gold to justify the health risks.
The sound of successful cleanup involved excited discussion of gold quantities found, while unsuccessful operations featured either silent disappointment or angry recriminations about wasted effort, creating acoustic indicators of whether season's work had justified investment or whether another year would be needed to recoup losses. The logic of continuing versus quitting reveals sunk cost fallacy in action. Miners who found minimal gold faced decision about whether poor results meant they should try again with better technique or different location, or whether they should accept losses and abandon mining before wasting additional time and resources on ultimately unprofitable ventures. Evidence from departure records shows that many miners left Klondike after single unsuccessful season, while others persisted for years despite mounting debt and diminishing prospects, creating selection process where those who stayed were either genuinely successful, irrationally optimistic, or simply unable to afford return journey and were trapped by circumstances. The taste of success, actual gold in hand after months of speculation, created euphoria that validated all suffering and immediately triggered planning for next season's expanded operations, while taste of failure created bitter realization that year of brutal labor had produced nothing but debts and physical deterioration that might never fully recover. But mining success or failure meant nothing if you couldn't actually survive the brutal conditions for an entire year, which required solving food supply challenges that would make modern meal planning look trivial, managing nutrition on a diet that would horrify contemporary dietitians, and accepting that balanced meals actually meant whatever doesn't cause immediate scurvy or starvation. Picture meal planning, where your dietary variety consists of beans, bacon, and bread in endless rotation for 12 months, with exciting dinner meaning slightly different preparation of same 3 ingredients, and balanced nutrition being a concept that wouldn't be invented for another several decades, essentially running human experiment in dietary monotony that would make modern prisoners complain about cruel and unusual punishment. Supply inventory records show that typical miner's year-long food cache consisted of approximately 400 pounds flour, 200 pounds bacon, 100 pounds beans, plus smaller quantities of sugar, dried fruit, and coffee, creating menu options that ranged from beans with bacon to bacon with beans to let's get crazy and have both beans and bacon with some flour-based accompaniment. The smell of bacon grease became so pervasive that everything cooked absorbed it, creating a situation where even foods that shouldn't taste like bacon somehow developed bacon undertones, because there was no escaping fat residue that coated every cooking surface and utensil. The sound of beans soaking became daily acoustic indicator that tomorrow's meals would be nutritionally similar to today's, which were identical to last week's, which would continue unchanged until supplies ran out or spring arrival enabled dietary variation. The logic of 3B diet reveals brutal caloric efficiency. Bacon provided fat and calories. Beans offered protein and some nutrients. Flour created bread that filled stomachs and provided carbohydrates, together forming nutritionally incomplete but calorically adequate diet that could sustain heavy physical labor if you didn't think too hard about what adequate nutrition actually required. The evidence from miners' health records shows widespread nutritional deficiencies despite adequate caloric intake, suggesting that enough food and proper nutrition were different concepts that Gold Rush diet satisfied for former while catastrophically failing at latter. The taste of monotony became psychological challenge as profound as physical hardships, with some miners reporting that they could barely force themselves to eat meals that were nutritionally necessary, but had become so predictable that appetite disappeared, despite genuine hunger. Imagine being simultaneously starving and completely uninterested in available food because you've eaten identical meals for 200 consecutively. Modern dietary variety, where people complain about having nothing to eat while surrounded by dozens of options, would seem incomprehensible to miners whose complaint was having only 3 things to eat and we're running low on 2 of them. Picture disease, where your teeth start loosening. Old wounds reopen spontaneously, and bruises appear without impact, all because your diet consists entirely of foods that contain 0 vitamin C, essentially discovering through personal experience that humans require nutrients beyond just calories, and that enough food doesn't automatically mean won't develop preventable diseases. Medical records from Klondike show scurvy was endemic among miners, with symptoms ranging from bleeding gums and joint pain to severe cases where tooth loss and inability to heal wounds made continued physical labor impossible. The smell of infected gums became common enough that miners developed dark humor about whose teeth would fall out next, treating serious medical condition as inevitable inconvenience rather than preventable crisis. The sound of miners discussing remedies, some legitimate, some completely fabricated, created information environments where accurate medical knowledge competed with folk cures and desperate experimentation. The taste of spruce needle tea, one of few available vitamin C sources, became familiar for those who'd learned that indigenous knowledge about anti-scurvy plants was more reliable than dismissive attitudes that had prevailed until symptoms appeared. The logic of scurvy prevention reveals tragic information gap. Fresh vegetables and fruits prevented condition, but bringing fresh produce to Yukon was logistically impossible, and growing it locally required agricultural knowledge and growing season that most miners lacked. Dried potatoes retained some vitamin C, but many stampeders had economized on supplies by skipping items they considered non-essential, creating false economy where saving money on supplies cost health that couldn't be purchased at any price. The evidence from treatment attempts shows that miners who recognized symptoms early and adjusted diets had better outcomes than those who ignored problems until advanced stages made recovery difficult. Some traded gold or worked odd jobs in Dawson to afford fresh goods when available, while others stubbornly continued inadequate diets until physical collapse forced recognition that their meal planning had serious flaws. Archaeological evidence of wild plant gathering shows that desperate miners foraged for anything edible, sometimes with success when they found berries or edible plants, sometimes with tragic results when they misidentified poisonous species and discovered that starvation wasn't only food-related danger they faced. The taste of desperation mixed with gradual physical decline created psychological impacts where miners watched their bodies deteriorate from nutritional deficiencies while simultaneously destroying themselves through physical labor, creating compound health crises that were entirely preventable with knowledge and supplies they didn't possess. Picture protein acquisition system, where success means shot something edible. Failure means continue eating bacon exclusively. And the hunting process requires time away from mining that you can't afford to waste unless hunt succeeds, creating risk calculation, where unsuccessful hunting meant you lost both protein and productive work time. Game availability records show that wildlife near mining camps was quickly hunted out, forcing hunters to travel increasingly far from claims to find game, with each mile of travel representing hours not spent mining and calories burned that needed replacement through successful hunt or reduced from already marginal diet. The smell of meat smoking or drying indicated successful hunt and temporary dietary improvement, creating sensory events that broke monotony of standard rations and provided psychological boost alongside nutritional benefits. The sound of gunshots in distance created hope that someone had succeeded in hunting, possibly meaning meat might be available for trade or purchase from successful hunters who had surplus. The logic of hunting reveals time theft problem similar to firewood gathering. Hours spent hunting were hours not generating income, but inadequate protein intake reduced physical capability for mining labor, creating situation where you had to hunt to maintain work capacity, but hunting reduced time available for actual work. Essentially, running optimization problem where correct answer wasn't obvious and varied based on factors outside your control. The evidence of meat storage techniques shows that miners used natural freezing during winter and smoking or drying during warmer months. But both methods had failure rates where improper storage or handling led to spoilage that wasted valuable food and represented lost hunting effort. The taste of slightly questionable meat became familiar as miners made risk calculations about whether suspicious-smelling protein was still safe to eat, or whether it had crossed threshold into dangerous territory. Game processing required butchering skills that many urban-raised miners didn't possess, leading to wastage where edible portions were discarded through ignorance, and valuable materials like hides or organs were thrown away by people who didn't know their utility or how to prepare them properly. The taste of fresh meat after weeks of preserved bacon created almost overwhelming sensory experiences, where dietary variety was so rare that even gamey or tough meat seemed luxurious by comparison to endless repetition of standard supplies. Picture simple task of making bread, requiring hours of process. Collect and melt snow or ice, because liquid water doesn't exist naturally in winter. Heat it using firewood you spent yesterday cutting. Mix with flour that's probably frozen solid and needs warming. Knead dough with hands that are still cold from outdoor work. Bake using wood stove that requires constant temperature management, all before you can eat breakfast and start actual mining work. The smell of bread baking created rare, positive sensory experience in otherwise harsh environment, but also represented significant fuel consumption and time investment that some miners tried to minimize by baking large batches less frequently, accepting that bread quality suffered from extended storage in damp cabin conditions. The sound of ice being chopped and water boiling became so routine that it created acoustic background indicating normal daily function, while absence of these sounds suggested either someone had given up on proper nutrition or had run out of fuel for cooking, both concerning indicators of declining situation. The logic of water acquisition reveals absurd labor requirement. Water source was literally everywhere in frozen form, but converting it to usable liquid required fuel and time that had to be stolen from other activities. The taste of melted ice snow water carried distinctive flat flavor that some miners claimed to prefer over regular water, while others found it subtly unpleasant reminder of their circumstances. The evidence from cabin remains shows that some miners developed efficient systems with water constantly warming near stoves and bread baking integrated with other heating activities, while others struggled with ad hoc approaches that wasted time through poor planning and inadequate equipment organization.
Tea preparation provided both psychological comfort and warm liquid that felt necessary in cold environment, but represented additional fuel consumption and time investment, where every cup required decision about whether momentary comfort justified resource expenditure. Imagine calculating cost-benefit analysis for every hot beverage. The taste of sourdough starter that miners maintained across seasons created continuity and slight dietary variation, but required ongoing maintenance that was another small time theft from schedule that was already overfull with survival tasks competing for limited hours. Picture schedule, where ideal plan is 12 hours mining, 6 hours survival maintenance, 6 hours sleep. But reality involves mining progress slower than planned, maintenance tasks taking longer than expected, and sleep being interrupted by cold cabin, body aches, or anxiety about whether entire venture will succeed, creating actual schedule more like 8 hours frustrated mining, 10 hours dealing with survival requirements, 6 hours of low-quality sleep interrupted by various discomforts. Daily routine analysis shows that theoretical 12-hour workday assumed everything went perfectly. Tools didn't break, weather cooperated, physical capability remained constant, and no emergencies arose, essentially requiring conditions that never actually occurred for more than brief periods before reality reasserted itself through equipment failure, weather crisis, or physical exhaustion. The smell of kerosene lamps burning late into night indicated miners trying to extend productive hours beyond daylight. But working by lamplight in cramped cabins with inadequate ventilation created air quality issues that competed with time gains. And lamp fuel was expensive supply that miners couldn't casually waste. The sound of early morning activity indicated miners rising before dawn to maximize daylight hours. But chronic sleep deprivation accumulated over months created cognitive and physical impairments that reduced work quality and created safety risks. Imagine operating heavy equipment and working in dangerous conditions while increasingly exhausted and recognizing that mistakes could have permanent consequences. The logic of time allocation reveals that as mining season progressed, physical deterioration from poor diet and accumulated exhaustion meant that later months' work required more time and effort to achieve same progress as earlier periods when bodies were fresher and enthusiasm hadn't been ground down by months of monotonous labor. The taste of miners' journals shows frequent complaints about never having enough time, needing to choose between adequate rest and maximum productivity, and recognition that pushing too hard led to injuries or illnesses that cost more time than they saved through extra work hours.
The taste of coffee, consumed to maintain alertness beyond body's natural limits, created dependency, where miners used stimulants to compensate for inadequate rest, creating cycles where artificial energy enabled longer work periods that required more stimulants to maintain, gradually degrading overall health and capability. Picture body slowly consuming itself, because diet provides calories but lacks essential nutrients, with visible results including muscle loss despite heavy physical labor, declining strength and endurance, and general deterioration that made each month's work harder than previous month, despite theoretically gaining experience and efficiency. Medical examination records from doctors who treated returning miners show widespread physical deterioration, significant weight loss, often 30 to 50 pounds, muscle wasting, dental problems, and various nutritional deficiency symptoms that required months of proper nutrition to reverse, with some damage being permanent. The smell of unwashed bodies whose owners lacked energy for personal hygiene created environments where declining standards reflected physical capability rather than just relaxed standards, essentially reaching point where basic self-care became luxury that exhausted bodies couldn't afford after completing survival essential tasks. The sound of labored breathing during tasks that should have been manageable, indicating declining cardiovascular capacity and muscle strength, with miners noticing that work requiring less effort earlier in season became increasingly difficult as bodies adapted to inadequate nutrition by cannibalizing muscle tissue for energy. The logic of physical decline reveals death spiral potential. Declining strength meant less mining progress, which meant less potential gold recovery, which meant less ability to purchase supplemental foods if available, which meant continued inadequate nutrition and further physical decline, essentially running negative feedback loop where initial nutritional deficits cascaded into broader health crises. The evidence from weight records shows that miners who arrived healthy typically lost 20–30% of body weight during first season, with losses continuing if they remained for additional years without significantly improving nutrition. The taste of exhaustion became so familiar that miners lost perspective on how compromised they'd become, with some not recognizing severe deterioration until returning to civilization and seeing others' shocked reactions to their appearance. Muscle loss particularly affected ability to perform physical labor that mining required, creating cruel irony where occupation demanding maximum physical capability systematically destroyed that capability through inadequate nutritional support for work being performed. But physical survival and adequate nutrition meant nothing if psychological pressures destroyed mental health first.
because isolation, monotony, and uncertainty about whether entire venture would succeed created social and psychological challenges that could break even physically healthy miners, especially those who'd made the fatal mistake of attempting Klondike survival solo rather than partnering with someone to share both work and sanity-preserving human interaction.
Picture survival mathematics, where two partners can accomplish more than twice what solo miner achieves. One person working underground while other operates hoist, alternating shifts to maintain continuous progress, sharing cabin heating costs and food preparation labor, but also introducing interpersonal dynamics, where personality conflicts in tiny cabin during 8-month winter could escalate from minor irritation to situation where murder seemed like reasonable solution to roommate disputes. Partnership records show that paired miners had significantly higher success rates and lower mortality than solo operators, but also generated most violent conflicts when partnerships deteriorated under stress of isolation, monotony, and goal-driven paranoia about whether partner was stealing or planning to steal accumulated wealth. The smell of close quarters living with someone whose hygiene standards might differ from yours created constant, low-level stress that was manageable during good times but could become flashpoint during conflicts, when every annoying habit magnified into major grievance by proximity and inability to escape. The sound of partners breathing, eating, or working became either reassuring human presence or maddening intrusion depending on relationship status, with some partnerships developing into lifelong friendships, while others ended in violence that sometimes resulted in one partner taking permanent dirt nap, while survivor explained accident to skeptical authorities. The logic of trust in partnerships reveals fundamental tension. You needed reliable partner to maximize mining efficiency, but sharing potential gold discovery with someone meant splitting wealth and creating opportunity for betrayal that could cost everything you'd worked for. Essentially, running business partnership, where contract enforcement consisted of hope your partner isn't planning to eliminate you and take everything. Evidence from dispute resolution records shows that gold-related partnership conflicts were common enough that mining communities developed informal arbitration systems, though these worked better for financial disagreements than for situations where one partner had already decided that 100% of gold was better than 50% if you were willing to accept certain moral compromises. The taste of paranoia mixed with dependency created psychological conditions where you simultaneously needed your partner for survival and suspected them of plotting against you, making every interaction carry subtext of Are they trustworthy ally or future threat? Imagine corporate partnership, except your business partner lives with you 24/7, and there's no HR department to mediate conflicts. Picture entertainment district, where alcohol was cheaper than food. Gambling operated 24/7, and various other recreational activities competed for miners' attention and remaining money. Essentially running vice economy, where businesses profited from people's desperate need to escape reality of brutal mining existence, even if escape meant spending gold they'd worked months to acquire. Economic records show that saloons and gambling halls in Dawson generated more reliable income than most mining claims, with some establishments making fortunes while their customers systematically converted hard-won gold into hangovers, regrets, and empty pockets that would require another mining season to refill. The smell of whiskey mixed with tobacco smoke and unwashed humanity created sensory environments that were simultaneously appealing as social spaces and depressing as reminders of how many miners were destroying themselves through substance abuse that started as reasonable stress relief and evolved into dependencies that consumed more gold than they'd ever earned. The sound of music, laughter, and occasional violence from saloons indicated active social life that provided necessary psychological relief from isolation, but also created temptation where short-term pleasure competed with long-term financial goals, and where just one drink could cascade into week-long binges that destroyed months of disciplined saving. The logic of alcohol consumption reveals that moderate use provided genuine psychological benefits through stress relief and social connection, but determining moderate was challenging when you were exhausted, isolated, and uncertain whether continued mining effort would ever pay off, essentially self-medicating for conditions that alcohol temporarily relieved while creating new problems that required additional self-medication. The evidence from medical records shows that alcoholism was endemic among miners, with some developing dependencies so severe that they couldn't function without regular consumption, creating situations where people who'd survived months of brutal conditions destroyed themselves through recreational choices that seemed reasonable at the time. The taste of cheap whiskey became associated with temporary escape from reality of mining existence, creating psychological reward cycles where alcohol provided immediate pleasure that mining labor couldn't match, making it difficult to maintain focus on long-term goals when short-term relief was literally available at every street corner. Picture legal system where law enforcement consisted of miners' meetings where community voted on guilt and punishment, creating justice that ranged from surprisingly fair to mob rule, depending on who was popular and what evidence was available. Essentially running democratic judicial system except the voters were exhausted, possibly drunk, and their verdicts couldn't be appealed to higher authority that didn't exist. Historical records of miners' meetings show that theft was treated more severely than violence, because stealing supplies could mean death for victims during isolation when replacement wasn't possible, creating priorities where property crimes received harsher punishment than assault, unless assault was severe enough to prevent victim from working their claim. The smell of crowded meetings where unwashed miners gathered to dispense justice created sensory environments indicating community attempting to maintain order through collective action, though effectiveness varied based on case details and whether accused had friends who could influence proceedings. The sound of testimony and deliberation operated without lawyers, formal procedures, or guaranteed rights, creating situations where eloquence and popularity mattered more than actual guilt or innocence. Imagine trial where jury selection is everyone who showed up, legal representation is speak for yourself, and sentencing guidelines are whatever seems appropriate to majority of people present. The logic of informal justice reveals both necessity and danger. Without formal law enforcement, communities needed some mechanism for resolving disputes and punishing serious offenses. But miners' meetings could be manipulated by popular individuals or mob mentality that resulted in unjust outcomes. Evidence from punishment records shows that serious crimes resulted in banishment, which was effectively execution given survival challenges of traveling alone through wilderness without supplies, while lesser offenses might result in public shaming, required restitution, or community labor that benefited everyone. The taste of rough justice mixed with pragmatic necessity created legal environments where fairness was aspirational rather than guaranteed, and where being likable was as important as being innocent when facing accusations from community that would determine your fate through show of hands. Picture entertainment options in isolated mining camp, where leisure activities consisted of card games using worn decks, storytelling that grew more elaborate with each retelling, and maybe occasional musical performance if someone brought an instrument they somehow hadn't abandoned during supply relay. Essentially, running entertainment industry where all content was locally produced and consumption was mandatory because alternative was sitting in dark cabin contemplating whether your life choices were sound. Diary entries describe card games that lasted for days with same participants, creating gambling systems where money changed hands repeatedly, though nobody was actually getting wealthier, since you were just trading the same gold back and forth, while wasting time that could have been spent mining or resting. The smell of lamp oil burning during evening gatherings, indicated social activities that provided psychological relief from isolation, though cost of fuel meant that entertainment competed with other survival necessities, and every hour of socializing required explicit decision that human contact was worth resource expenditure. The sound of harmonica, fiddle, or singing created acoustic events that broke monotony and provided reminder that civilization and culture still existed even in remote mining camp, though musical quality was less important than social function it served in maintaining morale and human connection. The logic of leisure time reveals that psychological health required some activities beyond work and survival. But determining how much time to allocate was difficult when every non-productive hour represented potential mining progress, and when success required maximizing work output over extended periods. Evidence from successful versus failed miners suggests that those who maintained some social engagement and recreational activities had better long-term outcomes than those who worked obsessively without breaks, possibly because psychological resilience required maintaining some connection to activities that made life worth living beyond just gold accumulation. The taste of communal meals or celebrations marked special occasions that provided breaks from routine and created shared memories that bonded communities, though these events required resource investment that some miners considered wasteful when supplies were limited and mining season was short. Picture sunk cost fallacy in action, where every month of unrewarded labor made quitting harder, because abandoning claim meant admitting that all previous investment was wasted, creating psychological trap where rational decision was to cut losses, but emotional investment demanded just one more season that could cascade into years of mounting debt and diminishing prospects. Psychological analysis of miner decision-making shows that hope became both motivation and trap. Optimism was necessary to sustain effort through brutal conditions, but unrealistic hope prevented rational assessment of when to abandon unprofitable ventures and admit that sometimes best decision is admitting failure before it consumes everything. The smell of desperation mixed with determination created environments where miners encouraged each other's irrational persistence, because admitting your own claim was worthless meant acknowledging that your friend's similar claim might also be worthless, creating social pressure to maintain collective delusion rather than face uncomfortable reality. The sound of conversations about almost finding it and just need to dig a bit deeper revealed cognitive patterns where miners reinterpreted lack of success as evidence they were close to breakthrough, rather than indication they should try different approach, or different location, or different occupation entirely. The logic of continued investment reveals that each season's expenses created additional reason to continue. Having spent X amount meant you couldn't quit until you'd recovered X. But recovering X required spending additional Y on another season's supplies, creating debt spiral where initial investment grew larger each year while prospects remained unchanged or worsened. Evidence from departure records shows that many miners left only after complete financial collapse, when they literally couldn't afford to stay, rather than making proactive decision to cut losses while they still had resources to start over elsewhere, essentially continuing until external circumstances forced termination, rather than making rational choice to stop. The taste of false hope, mixed with mounting evidence of failure, created psychological conditions where miners knew intellectually that continued effort was irrational, but couldn't emotionally accept that years of suffering had been for nothing, creating cognitive dissonance that some never resolved, even after returning home broke and physically damaged. Picture economic analysis showing that people who actually got wealthy from Klondike weren't miners, but merchants, transporters, and service providers who charged inflated prices for goods and services that desperate gold seekers would pay because they had no alternatives, essentially running an economy where suppliers extracted guaranteed income from miners whose gold hunting generated mostly disappointment and debt. Financial records show that businesses in Dawson and along transportation routes made consistent profits, while miners gambled on geological lottery, creating situation where pick and shovel salesmen made more money than people buying picks and shovels to dig for gold. Repeating pattern from every gold rush, where suppliers prospered while seekers struggled. The smell of fresh baked goods from commercial bakeries created market where people paid outrageous prices for dietary variety they couldn't produce themselves, with some women entrepreneurs making fortunes by recognizing that miners would pay premium prices for services that reminded them of civilization and home comforts. The sound of business negotiations involved prices that would seem insane in normal markets, but made sense when customers were isolated, desperate, and had limited alternatives. Imagine paying $50, $1897, for single meal because you're too exhausted to cook and the only restaurant in 500 miles knows they can charge whatever they want. The logic of entrepreneurship reveals that recognizing and serving miners' needs was more reliable path to wealth than actual mining. Laundry services, restaurants, entertainment venues, equipment rental, and countless other businesses extracted steady income from transient population that turned over constantly as failed miners left and optimistic newcomers arrived. Evidence of women's business success shows that despite being small minority in Klondike, many female entrepreneurs built substantial businesses through restaurants, boarding houses, and services that recognized miners' unmet needs better than male competitors who were too focused on mining to recognize more reliable business opportunities. The taste of commercial food after months of self-cooked monotony created market where quality didn't need to be exceptional, just different from what miners could produce themselves, allowing businesses to charge premium prices for mediocre products because customers were paying for variety and convenience rather than culinary excellence. We've reached the end of our journey through one of history's most ambitious examples of mass delusion meeting extreme survival challenges. What started as promotional promises about easy wealth in Alaska became brutal education in how human desperation, environmental hostility, and economic reality conspire to transform optimistic dreams into expensive lessons about limitations of individual determination when facing systemic challenges. The Klondike Gold Rush wasn't really about gold. It was about what humans will endure when convinced that fortune lies just beyond next mountain pass, next winter of brutal labor, or next season of gambling health and finances on geological speculation. For every person who found wealth, hundreds discovered that opportunity actually meant volunteering for conditions that tested physical and psychological limits in exchange for slim chances at returns that rarely materialized. Their legacy isn't just tales of those who struck it rich, but testament to human capacity for both remarkable endurance and remarkable self-deception. They proved that people could survive almost anything if convinced the suffering had purpose, while simultaneously demonstrating that hope and determination don't guarantee success when facing challenges that exceed individual capabilities regardless of effort invested. Perhaps most relevant lesson is that real winners weren't those who dug for gold, but those who recognized that supplying desperate people with necessities was more reliable path to wealth than joining the desperate people in their gambling. Every gold rush, every speculative bubble, every mass movement towards supposed opportunity tends to reward suppliers over seekers. Yet each generation rediscovers this lesson through personal experience rather than learning from previous examples. Tonight, as you consider your own life choices and financial strategies, maybe appreciate that your risks probably don't require walking across frozen mountain passes carrying half-ton of supplies, spending years digging through permafrost by hand, or accepting that dietary variety means beans with bacon versus bacon with beans. Modern opportunities may be less dramatic, but they're also less likely to result in scurvy,
frostbite, or permanent residence in permafrost. Drop a comment and tell us, what aspect of Klondike survival surprised you most? Did we help you appreciate that your job isn't as bad as hand mining frozen ground for 12 months? And where are you staying comfortably while listening to this story about voluntary suffering in pursuit of unlikely wealth? Sleep well, friends. And remember that human ambition has always driven remarkable achievements and spectacular failures, sometimes simultaneously in same venture. The gold rushes ended, but human tendency to believe this time will be different continues in new forms, making these historical lessons perpetually relevant, even as specific circumstances change. Sweet dreams, and maybe reconsider any investment opportunities that require relocating to remote wilderness and gambling everything on speculative ventures promoted by people who profit regardless of your success.